The truth about how Hitler recruited the leaders of his high civil command was not written in decrees or official orders. It was woven in private dinners, in confiscated villas, in parties bathed in stolen luxury, and in silences loaded with fear. They were not only generals in gleaming uniforms, they were bureaucrats, wives, businessmen, and academics who competed to demonstrate fanaticism, to live closer to the Führer, to receive a painting, an automobile, or an invitation. In that unrestrained race, obedience became initiative, crime custom, and privilege the definitive proof of belonging. The cultural and artistic circle. In the first years of the regime, Hitler understood that conquering culture was as decisive as conquering political power. His work table was not surrounded only by generals and bureaucrats. Architects, filmmakers, musicians, and museum directors also sat there. The recruitment of civil leaders moved in that ambiguous territory where art, social prestige, and politics merged into a single promise. To be part of the new Germany meant to shape its aesthetic spirit. The Berghof and the Chancellery became stages for cultural parades. In the corridors, architectural projects were discussed. Sketches of monumental buildings, models of avenues that were to redesign the German cities. Hitler received the architects with enthusiasm, discussed proportions, corrected details, pointed out columns and domes as if he himself were the author. Whoever managed to capture that fervor entered his inner circle. It was not about technical capacity, but about the willingness to become the executor of an aesthetic vision that sought to immortalize the Third Reich in stone and marble. Cinema played a similar role. A director invited to a private screening could leave with a multi-million contract or with a censorship order over his work. The criterion was simple: to please the Führer. There was no need for a ministerial decree to decide the fate of a film. A gesture of approval or an icy silence during the screening was enough. That arbitrariness turned each encounter into a ritual of seduction. Artists competed to read gestures, to anticipate which stories exalted Germanic greatness and which should be erased. To be recruited into that circle implied transforming talent into obedience. Musicians experienced the same tension. In the Bayreuth festivals, Wagner's notes resonated not only as art but also as propaganda. Attending those concerts meant more than enjoying music. It was to display oneself as part of a spiritual community that the regime presented as the essence of Germany. The cultural leaders who accepted that role recruited themselves, aware that each chord was a political gesture. The visual arts were looted and manipulated for the same purpose. Civil officials received orders to protect collections, which in reality meant confiscating paintings, sculptures, and entire libraries. An emptied house in Paris could reappear intact in the residence of a bureaucrat in Berlin. Recruitment did not occur in speeches, but in salons lined with stolen works. Whoever hung a requisition Vermeer in his dining room understood that his place in the regime was non-negotiable. His daily life was sustained by crime turned into aesthetics. Wives played a decisive role in this setting. They decorated with stolen porcelains, organized dinners where confiscated tapestries were displayed, flaunted tableware with others' monograms. They turned loot into a symbol of status and competed among themselves to show which home best reflected the splendor of the Reich. Cultural recruitment was also domestic recruitment. Entire families became trapped in the web of privileges. Artists, architects, and cultural managers who approached Hitler were drawn by that mixture of fascination and fear. Being received into his circle meant access to contracts, monumental commissions, and international prestige. But the price was evident: to renounce autonomy and become a cog in a project that turned culture into propaganda. Thus, aesthetics became a field of civil recruitment as effective as any ministry or army. Berchtesgaden, the alpine court of the Führer. The Obersalzberg, a wooded slope above the Bavarian village of Berchtesgaden, became the most exclusive stage of Nazi power. What had begun as a mountain retreat turned into a courtly microcosm where physical proximity to Hitler equaled political proximity. There, among renovated cabins, luxurious chalets, and confiscated residences, a fierce struggle was waged among hierarchs and civil officials. All wanted a house near the Führer because that postal address guaranteed influence, prestige, and access to the most closed circle of the regime. Hitler had discovered the area in the 1920s when he rented modest rooms in local farmers' houses. Over time, he acquired the Wachenfeld house, which he remodeled until turning it into the Berghof, a spacious villa with terraces open toward the mountains. As his power grew, so did the magnetism of the place. By 1936, the Obersalzberg was no longer an ordinary alpine corner. It was the secret heart of the Reich, the stage where informal meetings were held, where heads of state were received, and where, among strolls and teas, the destiny of Europe was decided. The magnetism of that space generated a fever of acquisitions. Ministers, bureaucrats, businessmen, and high officials began to pressure to obtain land and build houses nearby. The competition was fierce because the plots were limited and geography itself ordered the hierarchies. The closer to the Berghof, the higher the rank. Living a few minutes' walk from the Führer meant being available for any improvised invitation, sharing after-dinner conversations, appearing in informal photographs. Being Hitler's neighbor was in itself a credential of power. The SS and the Chancellery took charge of clearing the area. Local farmers were expelled from their lands, many under threats or ridiculous compensations. Jewish families were dispossessed of their houses, which then passed into the hands of hierarchs. The colonization of the Obersalzberg was, in reality, a social cleansing operation. Only the loyal remained. The mountain became an exclusive reserve of the regime, guarded by patrols, closed to tourist access, and with private roads that connected the residences. Whoever obtained a plot there knew that it had not been achieved by chance, but because he had been accepted into the inner circle. The landscape changed rapidly. Where once there had been meadows and farms, villas with columns, balconies, and carefully designed gardens arose. Martin Bormann was the great architect of this metamorphosis. He managed expropriations, directed constructions, and decided who could settle and who could not. His influence grew to such an extent that he was known as the Mayor of the Obersalzberg. Whoever wanted land had to go through him, which gave him immense power over the private life of the hierarchs. To be recruited into that alpine court also meant earning Bormann's favor. The residences became stages of ostentation. Goering built a sumptuous chalet surrounded by forests where he organized lavish receptions. Goebbels built a more discreet but highly symbolic house, seeking to display simplicity in front of his rivals. Other ministers and generals disputed the plots closest to the main road, hoping that Hitler might pass in front of their gardens during his daily walks. Each house was an architectural manifesto, not only a home but also a message of power. Wives played a central role in this competition. Organizing dinners in the Obersalzberg was equivalent to staging a political play. Confiscated porcelain tableware, French wines stolen during the occupation, tapestries hanging from freshly painted walls, everything served to show loyalty and prestige. A wife who managed to have Eva Braun accept an invitation could catapult her husband to a position of favor. Female rivalry in that alpine court was as intense as the struggles in the Berlin ministries. The Eagle's Nest, the Kehlstein house built on the mountain summit as a gift for Hitler's 50th birthday, completed the aura of the place. Although he used it little, the structure symbolized absolute dominance over the landscape. From its terrace, the border with Austria could be seen, and the mountains stretched out as a natural stage of power. The officials who were invited there understood that they were at the top, not only geographically, but also politically. Being photographed on that summit was equivalent to a consecration. Social life in the Obersalzberg was apparently relaxed, walks along mountain paths, outdoor teas, film screenings at the Berghof. But behind that bucolic facade, relentless struggles were waged. Each invitation counted, each absence was a cause for suspicion, each gesture could be interpreted as a sign of favor or misfortune. A bureaucrat who spent too much time in Berlin could be displaced by another who had known how to ensure a constant presence on the mountain. True power was not always decided in the Chancellery, but in those alpine after-dinner gatherings. Tensions extended into the intimate sphere. Some hierarchs competed for adjoining plots and did not hesitate to spread rumors to block their rivals' construction. Bormann, jealous guardian of the mountain, played with those disputes, favoring some and punishing others. The geography of the Obersalzberg became a chessboard where each house was a piece, and where closeness to the Führer equaled checkmate. The families of the hierarchs, settled in this artificial paradise, also found themselves trapped in the game. The children played in gardens that had once belonged to expelled farmers. The wives organized dances where alliances were sealed. The husbands knew that every detail of their domestic life could influence their career. The Alpine court was a total space, a place where politics blurred with private life, where each smile at lunch could mean a promotion and each social misstep a fall. Berchtesgaden ended up becoming a symbol of shared power. It was not only Hitler's retreat, it was the showcase of those who had been recruited into the innermost circle. The struggle to have a home there was, in reality, the struggle to become part of a Nazi aristocracy measured not in titles or merits, but in kilometers of distance from the Berghof. Intrigues and rivalries in the mountain. The Obersalzberg was not only a place of rest, it was a court of intrigues. The chalets built on the slope of Berchtesgaden hid behind their wooden and stone facades a silent war among the hierarchs of the Reich. Each window with views of the Berghof equaled a political advantage, each private path a reminder of hierarchy. Proximity to Hitler was measured in meters, and those meters translated into real power. Martin Bormann was the first to understand it. Appointed steward of the Obersalzberg, he controlled construction permits, land allocation, and service logistics. Under his hand, the mountain was transformed into an exclusive reserve, a sanctuary for the elite. But he not only organized, he used his position to manipulate. Any official who wished to build a residence inevitably had to go through him, and Bormann charged for that authorization in the form of loyalty. Thus, he turned topography into an instrument of domination. Göring, accustomed to luxury, built an opulent villa filled with hunting trophies, tapestries, and confiscated works of art. His receptions were spectacles designed to impress. But that ostentation irritated Hitler, who preferred the image of peasant austerity, and it gave Bormann an argument to attack him. In the corridors of the mountain, the murmur was repeated. Göring is too ostentatious, too distant from the National Socialist ideal. His own house, intended to reinforce his power, became a weapon that his rivals used against him. Goebbels played another strategy. His chalet was more modest, with an air of calculated simplicity. There he organized literary evenings, film screenings, and social gatherings that sought to present him as the intellectual of the regime. His private diaries reveal the unease he felt for not being invited as often as he wished to the Berghof. To compensate, he turned his own house into a stage of influence. He sought to attract Eva Braun and the wives of other hierarchs, convinced that feminine favor could open doors in the Alpine court. The mountain, for him, was not only a place of rest, but a battlefield where wars of prestige were fought among women and husbands. Albert Speer arrived later, but understood the game quickly. Hitler's trusted architect, he built a chalet with modern lines, less ornate than those of his rivals, but loaded with architectural symbolism. What he offered was not luxury, but aesthetics. A message that he, more than anyone, understood the Führer's vision of art and space. His closeness was expressed not in parties or banquets, but in the silent language of architecture. That subtlety earned him a special place because Hitler saw him as someone who shared his artistic sensitivity. The tensions among these men filtered into every dinner, into every walk. If Göring organized a hunt, Goebbels criticized his excess. If Speer showed plans for a future project, Bormann sought to overshadow him by insinuating excessive costs. No one attacked directly. The Obersalzberg functioned as a chessboard where the moves were indirect and where each smile could hide a dagger. The control of visits was another field of dispute. Hitler received diplomats and heads of state at the Berghof, and everyone wanted to be present. Bormann filtered who entered and who was left out, using that prerogative as a weapon of power. Sometimes it was enough to delay an invitation or prevent someone from crossing paths with the Führer to weaken their position. Officials soon understood that physical access was more decisive than any decree in Berlin. To be recruited on the mountain was, to a great extent, to survive that dance of exclusions and favors. The wives prolonged those struggles on their own ground. Emmy Göring, with her theatrical receptions, competed with Magda Goebbels, who used her charisma and the image of the ideal mother to gain prestige. Eva Braun, from her ambiguous position as Hitler's companion, sometimes played the role of arbiter, at other times that of a silent rival. The conflicts among them were not simple domestic jealousies, they had direct consequences on their husbands' careers. A poorly served dinner, a misplaced word, could ruin weeks of carefully woven intrigues. The Kehlstein house, the famous Eagle's Nest, became the stage for these competitions. Although Hitler visited it rarely, being invited there was equivalent to entering the sanctum sanctorum of the regime. The photographs taken on its terrace were political trophies. They showed not only alpine landscapes, but the physical closeness to the central figure of power. That is why each invitation to the Eagle's Nest was contested like a noble title, and each absence felt like a condemnation. Rivalry reached even the everyday, who greeted the Führer first on his walks, who walked closer to him, who received his approval in light conversations. All were gestures loaded with symbolism. The mountain amplified those tensions because it eliminated the formal distance of Berlin. There were no large offices or long lines of secretaries. Power was played face-to-face, in an environment where geographical proximity was confused with political intimacy. In that microcosm, Hitler was at once arbiter and spectator. He enjoyed watching his subordinates compete for his attention because that competition guaranteed his absolute control. No one could consolidate themselves too much. Bormann watched, Goebbels schemed, Goering displayed luxuries, Speer built symbols, all watched each other, and in that unstable balance Hitler found his greatest strength. The Obersalzberg was, ultimately, the stage where the play of absolute power was performed, a mountain court disguised as an alpine retreat where personal rivalries defined the politics of an empire. The functional mediocrity of the Nazi friends. Before each man fought for a plot in the Obersalzberg, it was necessary to gain the Führer's favor. Hitler never felt comfortable surrounded by brilliant personalities or by technicians with their own light. His instinct led him to prefer the mediocre, those who would never outshine him, and whose main ability consisted of obeying without reservation. The recruitment of civil leaders was based on that logic. Original minds were not sought, but grey figures capable of executing whatever was asked of them and of eternally thanking the privilege of having been chosen. The mechanism began in personal interviews. Hitler received bureaucrats and administrators in environments charged with tension, long tables, theatrical lighting, prolonged silences that forced the visitor to speak too much. In those conversations, he did not evaluate knowledge or experience, but the attitude toward his presence. Whoever appeared too confident was dismissed. Whoever stammered, sweated, or lowered his gaze rose in his preferences. Insecurity was the unmistakable sign that he had found someone moldable. The Nazi administration soon filled with grey men. In the ministries, the corridors were occupied by officials whose biographies lacked exploits, whose diplomas were modest, and whose personal ambitions had been mediocre until then. That lack of brilliance was precisely their credential. Hitler did not need great thinkers, but docile executors. Recruiting them consisted of turning mediocrity into virtue. The atmosphere of competition reinforced this tendency. Each bureaucrat knew that he would not gain prestige for his ingenuity or the solidity of his plans, but for his ability to show obedience. An infrastructure project was designed not to solve technical problems, but to reflect what the Führer had suggested in some vague speech. A decree was written not for its legal coherence, but for the fidelity with which it translated a slogan. Brilliance was punished with suspicion. Mediocrity was rewarded with promotions. The inner circle was populated by characters of this type. Men who, under normal circumstances, would have gone unnoticed in municipal offices suddenly found themselves at the head of ministerial departments. Their only merit was having demonstrated absolute submission. Hitler thus recruited not the best, but the most insignificant, and that insignificance turned into total dependence. Without the Führer, they were no one. Social settings confirmed this dynamic. At private receptions, the mediocre knew how to take their place. They spoke little, laughed at the right moment, nodded enthusiastically. They never interrupted, never imposed their own criteria. That ability to disappear in conversation was as valued as political loyalty. To be recruited meant learning to live in the leader's shadow, accepting that the only permitted light came from him. The fear of being replaced created a climate of servility. The recruited mediocres knew that anyone could occupy their position just as easily. They were not indispensable, and that fragility forced them to constantly prove their loyalty. Each decision was exaggerated, each report written in a grandiloquent tone that sought to please. Mediocrity was thus expressed in excessive zeal, in an almost anxious obedience that turned each administrative act into a race to please. In the ministries, examples multiplied. An entire office could spend weeks adjusting an irrelevant detail of a regulation simply because Hitler had mentioned it in passing. The officials knew that the effectiveness of the result did not matter, but the evidence of obedience. That was the essence of recruitment. To turn ordinary men into replaceable pieces of a machinery whose only center was the Führer. The contrast with the few brilliant figures who surrounded the regime was evident. Whoever showed intellectual autonomy ended up facing suspicions, rumors, or displacements. Mediocrity protected, intelligence condemned. Hitler thus ensured that the civil elite would never become a focus of alternative power. The recruited could not rival him because they lacked the capacity to do so. Even in the domestic sphere, this logic was reflected. The wives of the mediocre understood that their status depended entirely on the position their husbands occupied thanks to Hitler. The life of luxury and privilege could collapse from one day to the next if any of them showed misplaced initiative. That is why they reinforced obedience, pressuring their husbands not to deviate even a centimeter from the marked line. Mediocrity became a shared family value, transmitted as a guarantee of security. The aesthetics of the regime reinforced this policy. In official photographs and public events, Hitler always appeared as the central figure, surrounded by dim faces that barely stood out. It was not by chance. The image conveyed that around the Führer there were only servants. Recruiting them as extras in that staging was a way to consolidate the hierarchy. They accepted appearing as shadows because they knew that shadow guaranteed them a place in power. The administration was transformed into a stage of competitive mediocrity. Whoever wrote the most servile reports, organized the most grandiloquent ceremonies, or repeated the slogans with the greatest enthusiasm, rose. Genuine talents, if they existed, were diluted in that race to show loyalty. Hitler recruited the mediocre not by mistake, but because he understood that only they could guarantee a power without fissures. The role of the wives and the families. Nazi power was not sustained solely in offices and bureaus. It was also forged in private dining rooms, salons decorated with confiscated tapestries, and gardens where the wives received other women from the circle. Recruiting a civilian did not end with giving him a position. It was also necessary to involve his family, to turn the wives into active collaborators and the children into symbols of continuity. Loyalty thus became a domestic web that reinforced political bonds. The dinners in the residences of the hierarchs were rituals of selection. At those tables, Hitler was not always present, but his shadow permeated everything. A wife could secure her husband's promotion with a well-placed phrase, a gesture of devotion, or the organization of an impeccable evening. Female competition was fierce. Who served the finest tableware, who displayed the most dazzling jewels, who managed to show greater closeness to Eva Braun. Recruitment here meant turning the home into an extension of the party. The confiscated goods fed that dynamic. A Jewish house vacated in Berlin could reappear decorated with its furniture in the salon of a Nazi family. The women took care of arranging them, of making them shine, of presenting them as trophies at social gatherings. The visitors understood the message immediately. That family was in favor. It was part of the chosen ones. The stolen objects became credentials of belonging. Recruiting the husbands meant gifting the wives a world of luxuries impossible to reach by their own means. Motherhood was also used as an instrument. The wives who bore children for the Reich were celebrated in official ceremonies, received medals, and were photographed as examples of the German woman. The children became living symbols of racial purity, displayed in school parades, uniformed with youth insignias. An official whose home embodied that image gained additional prestige. Hitler thus recruited not only individuals but entire families, ensuring that loyalty would be transmitted from generation to generation. Jealousies and domestic rivalries were as intense as the clashes in the ministries. A wife could destroy another's reputation with a comment at a party, a rumor about infidelity, or a gesture of coldness toward Eva Braun. Hitler encouraged that silent competition. The more the wives confronted one another, the more they depended on his final approval. The husbands were trapped in those disputes, forced to sustain family ambition with greater obedience to the regime. On rest days at the Berghof, this mechanism reached its peak. While Hitler received international visitors, the women organized teas, walks, and small gatherings that were anything but trivial. In those conversations, it was decided who was inside the inner circle and who was left out. To be recruited did not only mean sitting at the Führer's table, but also being accepted into the feminine sociability that surrounded him. The families also served as showcases of propaganda. Carefully prepared photographs showed happy Nazi homes with smiling wives and healthy children. Each image circulated in newspapers and magazines, reinforcing the idea that the regime guaranteed prosperity. But those smiles hid the constant pressure to maintain an impeccable facade. Any deviation could be interpreted as a lack of faith. Recruiting the families was, in that sense, a way of ensuring a living, ever-available propaganda. The wives also acted as guardians. They controlled friendships, limited suspicious contacts, watched over the behavior of the children. Many were more zealous than their own husbands when it came to maintaining the purity of their environment. Recruitment meant that the Führer did not need police in every home. The women themselves took charge of disciplining the family. That domestic vigilance reinforced the cohesion of the system. There were also cases in which women directly pressured to obtain positions or privileges. A wife could insist that her husband deserved a promotion, remind of past favors, or invoke friendships with Eva Braun to secure advancement. That ambition turned families into active agents within the politics of the regime. Hitler benefited from it. The more they struggled to stand out, the more dependent they became on his approval. Luxury played a central role. Confiscated jewels, exclusive dresses, French perfumes obtained after a military campaign. Everything served as a marker of status. The women competed to show who was the favorite of the regime. The husbands, in turn, understood that keeping the family within that sphere of privilege required total obedience. Recruiting a civil servant did not only mean tempting him with power, it meant wrapping him in a web of family vanities impossible to abandon. The children, for their part, were displayed at private gatherings as proofs of loyalty. An adolescent in the uniform of the Hitler Youth, a girl raising her hand in salute, a group of siblings singing party songs. Those scenes were as political as any speech in the Reichstag. Childhood was transformed into an instrument of legitimization. Recruitment also meant educating the children in absolute obedience to the Führer, reinforcing the idea that the entire family was at the service of the Reich. The families became small centers of power, but also invisible prisons. The husbands knew that they could not abandon the regime without dragging along the social downfall of wives and children. The wives, aware of that, reinforced the need for obedience. Domestic life became so intertwined with power that each dinner, each party, and each family portrait turned into instruments of recruitment. The role of the wives and the families in the consolidation of the Nazi Civil High Command was as decisive as it was discreet. They did not appear in the official organizational charts, but they were in the backstage where it was decided who rose and who fell into disgrace. Their ambition, their jealousy, their luxuries, and their children were an integral part of the process through which Hitler recruited and secured the loyalty of those around him. Informal Nazi social circles, how a café could lead you to success. The Nazi regime was not built solely in ministerial offices or in mass speeches. It was also born and sustained in the most intimate social life. Taverns in Munich, dining rooms in private villas, parties at the Berghof, and gatherings in cafés where alliances were sealed that lasted much longer than the official ones. Whoever gained access to those spaces of informal sociability was automatically recruited into Hitler's orbit, not by position, but by belonging to a circle where politics merged with friendship, leisure, and even the banality of gossip. In the Bavarian beer halls of the 1920s, many of those ties were forged. The improvised speeches at sticky tables, the cigarette smoke thickening the air, the nationalist songs sung in unison, all that created an atmosphere of camaraderie that was never forgotten. When years later, some of those men appeared in the Chancellery, they did not do so as anonymous officials, but as old comrades who shared memories of beatings, arrests, and toasts. That common past was their passport to the Führer's trust. With the rise to power, those circles became more sophisticated. The Berghof turned into the epicenter of informal meetings where the line between leisure and politics disappeared. During the Alpine summers, the terraces filled with smiling figures, wives strolling through gardens, children running among fountains. It seemed an idyllic retreat, but every walk along the paths could mean a change of destiny. A casual comment beside Hitler, a gesture of deference, an opportune anecdote heard at the right moment were enough to seal a promotion. The struggle to be invited to those gatherings was fierce because being present meant being part of the inner circle. Private dinners had a ritual character. Hitler could speak for hours about architecture, music, or his memories of the Great War. The guests listened in silence, interrupting only to nod enthusiastically. There, state policy was not discussed, but futures were decided. An official who managed to capture attention with a timely story, a wife who knew how to entertain with an anecdote, could ensure the advancement of the entire family. To be recruited in those spaces meant accepting that power was distributed around a table among glasses of wine and dishes served with ceremonial precision. The circles of sociability were not limited to the Berghof. In Berlin, private receptions became stages of social competition. Each host tried to organize the most splendid party with orchestras, exotic flowers, luxurious decoration, and carefully selected guest lists. The content of the conversation mattered less than the spectacle of loyalty and prosperity. Being seen at those gatherings was equivalent to being recognized as a member of an elite. Absences, on the other hand, were interpreted as signs of disgrace. Organized leisure also played a fundamental role. Hunting trips in Bavarian forests, excursions to alpine lakes, days of skiing in reserved resorts. Each activity was a space for recruitment. The men showed camaraderie, shared jokes, exchanged favors. The women shone in elegant dresses, cared for etiquette, and strengthened networks of influence. In those settings, ministerial promotions were discussed between gunshots or in conversations by the fire. The bureaucratic apparatus found in nature an extension of its hierarchies. Informality also allowed loyalties to be tested. An untimely joke, an ambiguous phrase, or a barely veiled criticism could mean the end of a career. Everyone knew it, and that is why self-censorship was total. The circles of sociability became stages of mutual surveillance. Every smile had to be measured, every word calculated. To be recruited meant entering a permanent theater in which friendship was as dangerous as it was necessary. Jealousies and rivalries were expressed in those same spaces. A family that received more invitations than another aroused resentment. A wife who managed to be photographed with Eva Braun overshadowed her rivals. A bureaucrat who spent a weekend at the Berghof gained an advantage over one who had stayed in Berlin. Power was measured in invitations, in physical proximity, in how often one was called to those intimate settings. Cultural life also functioned as part of these circles. Film premieres, approved art exhibitions, concerts organized under the party's sponsorship. Each of those events became an opportunity to display loyalty. Being in the right hall, applauding with the proper enthusiasm, congratulating the right artist were gestures worth as much as signing a decree. Whoever did not understand this code was left behind. Whoever mastered it ascended without needing to show greater talents. The children were also pieces in this sociability. The boys played together in guarded gardens, attended special schools, wore the uniforms of the youth organizations. They grew up in an environment where politics was lived as something natural, every day. For their parents, those meetings were the perfect excuse to reinforce ties. A school outing could end in a business deal. A children's party could open the door to an administrative position. Recruitment also meant educating the offspring in the network of favors and friendships that sustained the regime. There were no minutes or records of these meetings. Power moved in whispers, in handshakes, in glasses raised in a private salon. Bureaucratic formality was secondary to the sociability that decided who entered and who was left out. The civil leaders who were part of these circles knew that their survival depended as much on the parties as on the offices, as much on a walk in the Alps as on a ministerial meeting. In that parallel world, Hitler did not need to exert direct pressure. It was enough for him to appear at a gathering, to show a gesture of sympathy towards someone, for the rest to understand who had been chosen. Recruitment thus became a silent process, disguised as friendship, coexistence, and shared leisure. The circles of informal sociability were in reality the places where power was decided without witnesses and where loyalty was demonstrated with smiles as much as with decrees. Ideology as a trial by fire. Ideological loyalty was the master key of recruitment. In a system where titles and experience could be worth little, what truly opened doors was the willingness to demonstrate fanaticism. It was not enough to accept slogans. One had to live them, breathe them, turn each gesture into a visible proof of faith in the Führer. That radicalism was the filter that separated the lukewarm from the chosen. Private meetings turned into stages of permanent examination. Hitler launched incendiary statements about Jews, Bolsheviks, or internal enemies. He did not expect debate. He looked sideways at those present, attentive to their reactions. A silence too long could be fatal. The enthusiastic laugh, the immediate nod, the phrase adding an even more extreme nuance were the responses that opened the way. To be recruited meant not only to agree, but to go one step further, to exaggerate fervor until it became a personal banner. In universities, factories, and ministries, ideology operated as a password. Whoever wanted to rise had to prove that he was willing to take the discourse to its ultimate consequences. A rector who expelled Jewish students without waiting for orders, a businessman who hung portraits of the Führer in every hall of his factory, a bureaucrat who proposed racial laws harsher than the party demanded. All of them stood out for transforming ideology into action. Hitler thus recruited those who proved through deeds that fanaticism was not an ornament, but the essence of their daily life. The ideological test infiltrated even the smallest gestures. A greeting too tepid could be interpreted as lack of faith. A wife who avoided speaking about the Reich's mission became suspicious. Children who did not sing youth songs with energy put the family's prestige at risk. To be recruited as a civilian within the system implied that the house, the office, and one's own body had to become instruments of living propaganda. The most brutal mechanism was anti-Semitism. Hostility toward Jews was not only official doctrine, it was the touchstone to measure the reliability of each individual. An official who showed reluctance to participate in confiscations or deportations was automatically excluded from the circle of trust. In contrast, those who volunteered to organize raids or supervise lists of expropriations were welcomed as valuable collaborators. Hitler, recruited by that standard, demonstrated hatred was the true credential of entry. In public acts, theatricality reinforced the test. The crowds cheered, the speakers repeated slogans, the arms were raised in uniform salute. But what really mattered was the intensity. The party's attentive eyes sought those who stood apart, who remained still, who did not show enough enthusiasm. Ideology turned each rally into a silent hunt, where the lukewarm were marked and the fanatics ascended. Writing also became a tool of recruitment. Essays, speeches, and memoranda were reviewed in search of fervor. Logic did not matter, but conviction. Whoever wrote a text imbued with hatred or exultation earned the trust of superiors. Many bureaucrats understood the dynamic and began to draft increasingly radical proposals, knowing that extremism was the fastest route to stand out. Paper became the stage of ideological faith. In the salons of the Berghof, this logic was repeated in other forms. Conversations apparently trivial about art, science, or history became covert tests. A guest who knew how to adapt any subject to the Reich's narrative, connecting a painting with racial purity or an experiment with German greatness, proved that he had internalized ideology. To be recruited was not simply to repeat slogans, but to think, speak, and feel under the prism of the dogma. Ideology was also a mechanism of purge. It was enough for someone to show a more moderate opinion to be displaced by another more radical. Thus, the civil circle was constantly renewed, always pushed toward greater extremism. Hitler did not need to give direct orders. The candidates themselves took charge of proving who was most faithful to the doctrine. Recruitment thus became a constant competition to demonstrate in every word and every act absolute devotion to the National Socialist creed. Are you Nazi enough? Ideology as a trial by fire. The Nazi regime built a peculiar method of selection. Mechanical obedience was not enough, nor even administrative efficiency. What determined who ascended in the orbit of power was the intensity with which one demonstrated ideological commitment. Loyalty was measured in gestures, phrases, visible actions that transformed faith into a political tool. Recruiting civilians for the high command meant subjecting them to constant tests in which ideology acted as a filter. Private meetings were the clearest stage. Hitler used to launch exaggerated statements filled with hatred and visionary promises. He did not explain, he did not elaborate. He simply threw phrases into the air, waiting for reactions. The eyes of those present shifted toward him anxiously. Some remained silent, fearful of saying something wrong. Others, more astute, intervened immediately, adding a comment even more radical than that of the Führer. In those silences and responses, much more was decided than in a ministerial council. It was determined who was worthy of trust and who was condemned to irrelevance. In universities and research centers, ideology was a permanent examination. Professors, deans, and scientists knew that their future depended on how they integrated the racial creed into their lectures and projects. Academic speeches, laboratory reports, even international conferences were evaluated not for rigor but for fervor. A study that exalted purity was rewarded. Another that doubted the principles of the Reich was condemned to oblivion. Thus, academic recruitment became a process of purification. Those who survived were not the most brilliant, but the most enthusiastic in dressing science in ideological garments. Companies experienced something similar. Industrialists who hung portraits of Hitler in every factory hall, who organized ceremonies with flags, and who dismissed Jewish employees even before laws were enacted, were the ones who ascended the ladder of favors. It was not enough to produce more or export better. What was decisive was the speed with which ideology was translated into action. Each dismissal, each expropriation, each speech before the workers became a trial by fire. To be recruited as a businessman of the regime meant proving that economic benefit was subordinate to dogma. In the homes, the dynamic was identical. Wives who organized charity events under the party's insignia, mothers who taught their children to sing nationalist songs, entire families who displayed flags on their balconies, all of them were subject to the same examination. Ideological faith became a domestic routine. A house decorated with Nazi symbols was both a place of residence and a political declaration. Whoever did not do it risked being labeled as lukewarm. Anti-Semitism became the core of this test. Hostility toward the Jews functioned as the definitive criterion to measure an individual's reliability. Participating in looting, supervising deportations, signing expropriation decrees, all this was part of the recruitment ritual. A civilian who volunteered for such tasks needed no further credentials. Hatred was his letter of introduction, the key that opened the doors of the inner circle. Public acts added another layer of demand. Inflamed crowds chanted slogans, raised their arms, repeated phrases again and again. But what truly mattered was not physical presence, but the intensity of enthusiasm. The watchful eyes of the party sought those who lagged behind, who applauded without energy, who failed to raise their arms with enough vigor. Recruitment was also theater, showing fervor in every salute, in every shout, in every look directed at the podium. Writing played a key role in this ideological test. Bureaucrats and officials knew that a memorandum, a report, or a simple speech could become a weapon for advancement. Writing with passion, including incendiary phrases, proposing measures even more radical than those demanded by orders, those were the signals sought. The pen, in the hands of a bureaucrat, became a mirror of his loyalty. Thus, the archives of the Reich filled with papers saturated with slogans, not because they were useful, but because they were proofs of faith. The gatherings at the Berghof showed another facet of this mechanism. There, in an apparently relaxed atmosphere, people talked about art, history, or architecture, but each conversation was an ideological trap. A guest had to demonstrate that he could connect any subject to the Reich's mission, a painting with Aryan glory, an engineering work with German rebirth, a historical passage with the eternal struggle against the enemy. Whoever managed to weave the dogma into the most trivial conversation ensured his permanence in the circle. Whoever did not was marked as expendable. Ideology was ultimately a permanent competition. It was not only about believing, but about proving each day who was more willing to carry the creed to its ultimate consequences. That race toward radicalization pushed the civil circle to ever greater extremes. No one wanted to be the moderate in a room full of fanatics, because that was equivalent to a political death sentence. To be recruited was to accept that dynamic, to live under continuous examination, knowing that the only way to survive was to display more fervor than one's neighbor. Now we can steal in the name of the Führer, the normalization of criminality. From the beginning, the regime turned crime into habit and presented it as duty. It was not an accident nor a secondary consequence. It was a calculated recruitment mechanism. Whoever joined the Reich's civil machinery had to dirty his hands immediately, to participate in acts that crossed the boundary of legality, to be bound with no return. Once someone had signed a confiscation document, authorized a deportation, or accepted a stolen painting to decorate his salon, he became an accomplice. The first steps were taken in anonymous offices, where bureaucrats filled out expropriation forms. Papers sealed with official ink hid behind their paragraphs the expulsion of entire families, the ruin of businesses, the looting of bank accounts. The bureaucratic tone camouflaged the violence. The officials knew that what they were doing was illegal under any previous norm, but the signature on the paper was their proof of belonging. To be recruited meant accepting that ink could be more lethal than a bullet. Cultural plunder extended that logic. Trains loaded with works of art crossed Europe toward Berlin, Vienna, or Linz. The crates were sealed with official labels, but inside them traveled centuries of history snatched from museums and private collections. Civil officials were in charge of receiving them, cataloguing them, and redistributing them. A sculpture could end up in a ministerial office, a painting in a bureaucrat's dining room, an entire library in his children's playroom. Those treasures were more than loot. They were invisible chains. No one could return them without betraying themselves. Recruitment also meant enjoying the stolen luxury and, in doing so, committing oneself forever. In the economy, criminality became a motor of advancement. Civilian companies accepted slave labor from concentration camps. Men and women torn from their homes worked to exhaustion in private factories, watched by overseers who knew exactly where they came from. The industrialists who profited from that exploitation could not claim ignorance. Recruitment consisted of accepting those exhausted bodies as part of the accounting, of integrating slavery into production figures. Once they did, they were trapped. Their prosperity depended on crime. Homes reflected this normalization. A proud wife showing off her new tableware knew it had belonged to an expelled family. A husband boasting of his luxury car knew the confiscated origin of the vehicle. The children who played with toys from other houses saw the names of their former owners erased. Daily life was filled with traces of theft, but instead of hiding them, they were celebrated as symbols of status. Civil recruitment was thus a family process. Complicity was distributed among all members of the household. Language became another tool to naturalize crime. Words like Aryanization or resettlement replaced theft and expulsion. Official documents spoke of protection when they meant plunder, of relocation when they meant deportation. Bureaucrats and officials repeated those terms naturally until they convinced themselves that they no longer participated in crimes but in administrative acts. To be recruited meant learning that new language, accepting it, and using it as if it were neutral. The rewards were immediate. Whoever participated in these practices received promotions, goods, and prestige. He became a trustworthy member of the system. But that trust was a trap. The more someone benefited from criminality, the more impossible it was to return to ordinary civil life. Each painting hung on the wall, each signature on a confiscation document, each hour of slave labor used in the factory bound him more tightly to the regime. Crime was not only a tool of power, it was a silent contract. In the occupied territories, criminality reached industrial dimensions. Civil governors administered entire plundered cities. Each truck loaded with grain, each train with livestock, each warehouse filled with confiscated furniture was part of the system. Local officials learned quickly. Whoever showed more zeal in stealing and redistributing gained Berlin's trust. Recruitment became a competition. The greater the greed, the greater the recognition. The symbolic component was no less important. Hitler wanted his collaborators to feel participants in a historical mission and to achieve that he needed them to cross a line with no return. By forcing them to steal, to deport, to administer slavery, he ensured that all shared the same guilt. No one could desert without exposing his own past. Shared criminality was the strongest glue. The recruited civilians remained loyal not only out of ambition, but out of fear of being unmasked. The private parties in confiscated houses showed the rawness of the system. The guests drank wine in stolen glasses, dined at tables that still bore the names of their former owners carved in the wood, and were entertained by music played on pianos seized from Jewish families. No one mentioned it, but everyone knew. That coexistence with crime was the true test of loyalty, to enjoy it without blinking. To be recruited meant integrating into that macabre theatre, where luxury was stained and everyone pretended not to see it. The system worked because it did not require solemn oaths. It was not necessary to gather anyone in a hall and force them to swear allegiance. It was enough to offer a stolen privilege and observe whether they accepted it. Whoever did was in. Whoever hesitated disappeared from invitations, from meetings, from circles of trust. Crime was more effective than any contract. It turned civilians into permanent accomplices, unable to escape a web they themselves had reinforced with every decision. Indirect obedience, working toward the Führer. The civil recruitment system of the Reich had a unique characteristic. It did not require explicit orders to act. What was expected of officials, businessmen, and bureaucrats was that they interpret Hitler's will, even when he had not expressed it clearly. That dynamic, known as working toward the Führer, became the cornerstone of the machinery of power. To be recruited did not mean receiving instructions, but demonstrating initiative in anticipating the leader's desire. In the Chancellery, this practice became a rule. Hitler presented vague guidelines, wrapped in ideological rhetoric, and left it to his subordinates to translate those phrases into concrete measures. If he mentioned the need to purify a city, a bureaucrat could draft an order for mass deportation. If he spoke of revitalizing the economy, a businessman proposed using prisoners as labor. The one who acted first, with greater determination, earned his trust. Recruitment was based on that competition, being the quickest to transform ambiguous words into brutal deeds. The method had a corrosive effect. Since there were no clear instructions, radicalization arose from below. Each official sought to prove that he understood the Führer's spirit better than anyone else. That race of interpretation generated a vicious circle. The more extreme the initiatives, the more likely they were to gain recognition. To be recruited into the system meant accepting that logic, where obedience was not passivity, but creativity in the service of dogma. The phenomenon spread to regional administration. Governors and mayors in occupied territories acted as if every phrase spoken in Berlin were a divine mandate. They ordered lootings, deportations, or executions without the need for confirmation. They knew that the more drastic their measures, the easier it would be to present them as proof of loyalty. Thus, indirect obedience recruited civilians of every rank, from municipal secretaries to state ministers. Even in daily life, that logic permeated the environment. Teachers adapted their classes to include racial references. Doctors made decisions based on eugenic criteria. Judges reinterpreted laws to justify expropriations. None of them needed to receive a direct order. It was enough to sense what favored the Führer's project. To be recruited at that level meant making dogma a permanent compass, capable of guiding even the smallest gestures. The consequences were devastating. By functioning as a decentralized system of obedience, the regime multiplied its capacities. It did not need an omnipresent Hitler. It needed civilians who became enthusiastic interpreters. Each official who anticipated an order expected to be rewarded, and that expectation drove him to go further. Civil recruitment was, in large part, a race to demonstrate initiative in the name of another. Material and status rewards in the Third Reich. The Reich did not recruit only through ideology or obedience. It seduced with tangible rewards. Luxury, property, and social prestige became effective lures to attract and retain civilians in the machinery of power. Each material reward was also an invisible chain. Whoever accepted it became trapped in a web of complicity that bound him forever to the system. The confiscated properties were the first great currency of exchange. Houses, villas, and apartments belonging to Jewish families or political opponents passed into the hands of officials, doctors, businessmen, or bureaucrats who had demonstrated loyalty. A signature in the land registry equaled a symbolic promotion. Suddenly, a man who had once lived in a modest apartment moved into a mansion in an exclusive neighborhood. Those moves were not merely improvements in housing, they were declarations of belonging to the new order. To be recruited meant accepting that one's home was stained by another's expulsion. The stolen art played a similar role. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and entire libraries were redistributed among civilians close to the regime. An official could receive as a gift a Renaissance painting for his salon, a businessman a collection of porcelains, a general a grand piano. No one asked about the former owners. Silence was part of the reward. Those objects turned domestic life into a constant reminder of fidelity to the Führer. Each time a lamp was lit or a glass was raised, the stolen luxury spoke of the tacit pact between beneficiary and regime. Privileges were not limited to material goods. There were also carefully managed social benefits, preferred tickets for mass events, seats of honor in parades, access to private circles of conversation, all formed part of a system of rewards. A civilian could measure his rise not only by the house he lived in, but by the seat he occupied in a grandstand or his proximity to the podium in a ceremony. Status was visible, public, impossible to hide, and it became a weapon of recruitment because everyone wanted to climb one step higher. The Reich's bureaucracy soon understood how to use those rewards as leverage. Administrative promotions were not mere acknowledgements of efficiency. They were linked to demonstrations of fervor and loyalty. A bureaucrat who proposed an especially radical measure could expect not only a larger office but also an official automobile, a better residence, or access to vacations in exclusive resorts. The message was clear. Political initiative was paid for with private comfort. The family was drawn into this game. A wife enjoyed a wardrobe full of confiscated dresses, the children attended elite schools created for Nazi youth, and the relatives received well-paid jobs in ministries or companies linked to the state. To be recruited meant dragging the entire family circle into a spiral of benefits from which no one could exit without losing everything. Domestic well-being became a guarantee of silence. The automobile was one of the most visible symbols of these rewards. In a country where private transport was still limited, having an official Mercedes with a driver included equaled wearing an invisible uniform of status. Driving those machines through crowded streets was a form of personal propaganda. It was not merely moving from one place to another. It was showing everyone that one belonged to the circle of trust. To be recruited meant displaying as much as possessing. Parties and private receptions were another showcase of rewards. A bureaucrat could invite colleagues to a dinner served on confiscated silverware with French wines obtained during the occupation and musicians playing pieces on stolen instruments. Luxury was not discreet. It was deliberately ostentatious, a constant reminder of what it meant to be inside the circle. Whoever participated in those gatherings knew that everything seen came from plunder, but also that such plunder was the prize for loyalty. Even vacations became rewards. Resorts on the Baltic, chalets in the Alps, residences on confiscated lakes were offered to those who had demonstrated obedience. Rest, which in other times had been a private matter, became a political privilege. Traveling to those places equaled displaying an invisible card of belonging. To be recruited also meant accepting that leisure was conditioned by loyalty. Social status was amplified through the media. The Reich's newspapers published photographs of officials and businessmen at official events, presenting them as models of the new Germany. Appearing on those pages was in itself a reward. It meant public recognition, official validation, one more step up the ladder toward the inner circle. No one wanted to be an anonymous bureaucrat. Everyone aspired to become the visible face of Nazi success. The structure of rewards functioned as a network of favors. Whoever received a painting, a house, or an automobile knew he had to respond with loyalty and silence. Gratitude was mandatory and became a mechanism of control. The stolen goods were not disinterested gifts. They were reminders that everything depended on the Führer and his circle. To be recruited meant accepting that personal prosperity was inseparable from collective crime. The collapse and dissolution of the circle. When the Reich began to crumble in 1944 and 1945, the civil court built on privileges and proximity faced its own fragility. The houses in the Obersalzberg, symbols of access and status, became targets of Allied bombings. What had been an exclusive alpine refuge ended reduced to smoking rubble, with furniture and tapestries scattered among ashes. The mountain, which had embodied the summit of power, was transformed into ruins open to looting. The hierarchs and bureaucrats who had fought for every meter of proximity to the Führer fled hastily. Some loaded official automobiles with suitcases full of porcelains, jewels, and stolen paintings. Others hid documents and memoirs in damp basements. The luxury accumulated over years of complicity became an uncomfortable burden, loot too heavy to carry in flight and too compromising to abandon. What had been reward turned into evidence. In Berlin, the civil circle that had orbited around Hitler in dinners, parties, and improvised receptions saw the choreography of the court collapse. The Berghof burned on the mountain, and in the capital the bunker became the only possible stage. Meetings were no longer relaxed teas but desperate gatherings in poorly ventilated basements. Those who had competed for closeness and favors now looked at one another with suspicion, wondering who would fall first, who would be able to negotiate survival with the victors. The collapse of the Reich exposed the fragility of the rewards. The confiscated mansions were returned or reassigned. The official automobiles seized by the Allies, the paintings and libraries stripped from their new owners. Families that had celebrated lavish dinners on stolen tableware now hid it in boxes, trying to erase traces of complicity. What had been a symbol of social assent became proof of crime. Many recruited civilians tried to reinvent themselves. Bureaucrats claimed they had acted under coercion. Businessmen asserted they were unaware of the origin of slave labor in their factories. Wives insisted that the dresses and jewels they had worn were mere gifts. The discourse became uniform. All sought to disguise the initiative they had once flaunted as merit. The fanaticism that had been the key to assent turned into an unbearable weight. To be recruited, in retrospect, appeared as a mark of shame. The Allied trials in Nuremberg and in smaller courts exposed that web of complicities. Documents that had circulated as mere administrative papers were presented as evidence of plunder, deportation, and extermination. Photographs of private dinners in confiscated houses became proof of how crime had been normalized in daily life. What had been pride turned into accusation. Civilians, like the military, had to face the mirror of their acts. Some managed to escape with cunning. Mid-level officials, invisible in grand chronicles, dissolved into the post-war world, reappearing as merchants, lawyers, or teachers in rebuilt towns. Their recruitment had been deep, but their anonymity protected them. Others, in contrast, carried their stained names for decades. Collective memory marked them as accomplices, and their families bore the stigma of having lived in stolen houses and dined on tableware stained with blood. In the Obersalzberg, the ruins remained as a physical reminder of that fall. The locals, who had once been expelled, returned to devastated lands. Among the remains of the Berghof and the ministerial villas, they found pieces of porcelain, fragments of sculptures, remnants of charred furniture. The Alpine court had dissolved, and in its place remained a landscape of destruction that starkly displayed the fate of privileges built on violence. The fall of the Reich was also the fall of a lifestyle built on material and status rewards. Those who had been recruited not only lost power, they lost the mask of respectability those rewards had given them. The automobile, the mansion, the painting, the seat in the grandstand, all that had served to mark distances and hierarchies was reduced to ruin, proof, or uncomfortable memory. The intimate circle of civilians, which had orbited with enthusiasm around the Führer, dissolved among rubble, tribunals, and silences that weighed for generations.